Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for ATM Virtual. We really appreciate you taking the time to be part of our online discussion today. We're really lucky to have two of the world's leading tourism industry chief executives with us here today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Keith Tan. He's the chief executive of Singapore Tourism Board, which has been extremely proactive in paving the way for Singapore's post-pandemic recovery. And I believe that Singapore enters phase one of its three-stage reopening strategy today. Yeah, so we've just been talking about that, and we'll be filling you in on that in a minute. Now, joining us soon, he's a little bit delayed, but I'm sure he won't be long. We also have Fahad Hamaduddin, who's the Chief of Investment Strategy and Tourism Marketing at Saudi Tourism Ministry. And he'll be shedding a little more light on the kingdom's tourism industry plans as travel starts to resume. So, as Keith is here, we'll kick off with Keith. Now, Keith, what's really interesting is because Singapore dealt with SARS in 2003, it really did prepare you, didn't it? Could you tell us a little bit about what SARS taught you and how that enabled you to be prepared for COVID-19 pandemic?
SARS was really the first major public health crisis that the tourism industry in Singapore faced on such a large scale. And to be honest, we were caught quite flat-footed in many ways. But we learned key lessons from that and have been rehearsing ever since then, all these years since 2003. From my perspective in the tourism sector, one of the things we learned was that the government can't do everything. The government won't know everything. And one of the key things that we learned from SARS was the need to really have very tight public-private partnerships and collaborations in dealing with the crisis, in thinking about how we slowly reopen the tourism sector, and in planning a course for recovery. And that we applied this time around as well. So in the very early days of the COVID pandemic, I believe this was as early in February, I had already announced the formation of a tourism recovery action task force comprising private sector individuals and key players from within the government as well to lay out plans, not just for recovery, but it's really crisis communications, how we engage the sector, how we translate the many different advisories and directives coming from the health ministry, and how we translate that into all the different settings in the tourism sector. And that has proven to be very effective because ultimately we know that as a government agency, we won't know everything. We won't know all the different considerations of the tourism sector, and we need the private sector to come on board and advise us on what is useful, what is practicable, what is wise, and especially as we now start to plan towards the reopening of the economy and thereafter the recovery, tourism recovery. So that's number one, public partnerships. Number two, was we were hamstrung in many ways in SARS because we had less technology. Hamstrung in some ways, but it also provided some more space for government to do certain things. Now we have so much more technology, digital tools, and capabilities, and we've learned over the years how to apply these tools in service of public health concerns, and we've applied these also to the tourism sector. So, for example, how do we use technology and tools to communicate quickly to guests, to customers, to visitors? How do we use technology to address people's concerns about cleanliness and sanitization and so on? So that's been a big thrust of our efforts here in Singapore in this pandemic. And thirdly, the importance of really activating a whole of society, whole of nation effort at raising thinking and the conditions on sanitization and cleanliness. So what we've done in this case was to do a national movement called SG Clean. Uh, and this is now, think of it as a national auditing effort to raise the water level, the overall standards of cleanliness and sanitization. Now, Singapore already has a reputation for cleanliness and sanitization, but we're going a further step to do this, to raise levels of commitment and resources put in by the private sector, by attractions, hotels, shopping malls, to permanently improve their sanitization and cleanliness. And this, we believe, will be an important path forward for us as we recover from COVID-19.
Wow, well, that's a really great start to this session. Thank you. And I will come back to the SG Clean and what you were saying about using technology to get the message.
Absolutely.
Because I think
Sure.
doing all these things is great, but if people around the world don't know about them, yeah, you know, obviously that's the key, isn't it? Now, Fahad, thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
Very well. How are you,
Good.
Gemma?
I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to have you. I've introduced you so everybody knows who you are. So
very glad and grateful to be with you.
To recap, because you came in just a little bit after Keith started, he was just talking about how SARS in 2003 prepared Singapore a little bit. Obviously, different situation, bigger scale, but they were talking about public and private partnerships. Now, I know that's something that Saudi Arabia really values, doesn't it, during this time? Could you tell us a little bit about the private-public relationships and how that's working to help tourism during this difficult time?
Yes, sure. Again, I'm very glad to be with you here. So we look at the sector as extremely strategic for us in Saudi Arabia, but we also realize that this sector has contributed 20% of the jobs in the past 5 years across the world. This definitely means it's a global deserving attention by governments. And here we also, Saudi Arabia plays a government leadership role because of its chairmanship of the G20. So we have two folds. One that is internationally focused and one that is domestically focused. Now we realize that this sector is a private sector led. Our job is to help the private sector to survive and weather as much as we can this pandemic, as well as fast track demand and meanwhile create the necessary stimulus to help those most in need in the business. So Saudi Arabia launched over $61 billion worth of stimulus. And that went into multiple tracks. The first track is addressing up to 60% of the pay to Saudis in the sector. We also waived all the licensing fees for, and we deferred the VAT and government fees for all SMEs. And definitely the tourism fees were all waived. And we are looking at helping the private sector in getting the people trained. As you know, this sector is still new in Saudi Arabia. In a way that it's new to welcome international visitors from around the world. So we've taken as government the heavy lifting in terms of costs and tried to shoulder the pain from the private sector. But in parallel with domestically, what we have done is we've repatriated all Saudi citizens that wanted to come back. And so that is around 100,000 people. What this served is both our citizens, but also our sector, because the hospitality sector was the recipient of all those repatriated when they first came back for the lockdown. And so that's domestically. Internationally, we worked with the UNWTO and WTTC to make sure we get the best global thinking in terms of how could we collaborate, because the fastest way to come out of this pandemic is for us to unify our measures. And that's the only way we can give global direction to airlines, to businesses, and all those that are generating the traffic with the same language and clarity. Now, Saudi Arabia was the first to, probably amongst those top or first four, to apply the safe stamp that was launched by the WTTC last week.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, apologies.
No, that's it. I
I
mean,
thought you'd frozen.
no, I think I just want to also allude to SARS. Saudi Arabia is I would say this is a good problem to have, is that we were affected by SARS, and we were when we were in the region, we established a lot of measures and developed our CDC center, our lab environments. So we are today by far largest the center of laboratory in the region. That's what global CDCs look at us for. Yeah.
Okay. Well, fantastic. We've touched on a lot of subjects there, and I was going to ask about the global perspective. It's all very well. Every country has its own standards, or areas within a country. Or hotels do one thing, other stakeholders do another. Keith, what are you doing in terms of global collaboration? I mean, having looked at your plan, it seems very much like a very good blueprint for other destinations to follow. What are you doing in terms of global collaboration, like Saudi with WTTC, you and WTO, and how do you think that this can be achieved so travellers know that wherever they go, if a country has that standard in place, they know what procedures have been put in place and they are confident to travel there?
Now, this was an issue that has been discussed at several international forums and discussions, because we all agree that we don't want to put up patchwork of different standards and requirements. One country has certain standards on health checks, another country has different standards. But this is not going to be easy, because ultimately we all have to take dressing, as it were, from our health authorities and what their requirements and risk perceptions are. And to be honest, different countries, health authorities, public health authorities will have different risk perceptions. So in countries that have higher risk perceptions, or rather lower risk tolerance, may want to put in place stricter checks at the borders once the travel restrictions slowly get lifted. Other countries may have less stringent or less rigorous or less demanding checks. So how do we reconcile? I don't have a good answer to that. This is something that we will need to have further discussions at regional level and international level. What we are trying to do is do it at the bilateral level with countries that we feel that we can move together, and we've announced things like green lanes, equivalent idea of travel bubbles, and in these bilateral discussions, then we hope to be able for example, Singapore and China, which we have announced, in our bilateral negotiations, then arrive at common standards, at least between the two countries, between Singapore and China. And with that, then hopefully we can replicate that with other countries, not dissimilar to the idea of free trade agreements, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, at the same time, of course, we must also recognize that this sector has a lot of international players. So international hotel chains. So in our conversations with the hotels in Singapore, many of whom belong to big international chains, they themselves have their own international standards as well. So how do I reconcile those hotel international requirements and international standards across, say, a chain like the Hiltons or the Marriotts, and reconcile those with our standards? And so these will require also quite a lot of discussions at the individual sectoral level.
Great. Fahad, just coming back to the health and safety measures, you talked about the WTTC and the safe stamp. How far along is Saudi in terms of implementing measures and getting all stakeholders together? Because Keith was just saying it's probably a lot easier with the hotels that are part of major groups. We all know they've all partnered with, SGS, Burrito, Veritas, etc. But you obviously have smaller hotel players, then you have your ground handlers. There's so many people to bring together. How are you doing that?
Before I answer this question, I want to go back to the point raised about the difficulty of this work. I think the challenge is not amongst Saudi stakeholders within the industry as much as it's between or amongst different countries, because the active variables there are so many. you have federal concerns, you have health concerns, and you have different response and trust level between citizens and their governments.
Yeah.
I mean, I can talk for Saudi. We've been very blessed with the kind of discipline that we've seen amongst the Saudi citizens in response to whatever rules were put in place. But when we try to take the safety stamp with the WTTC to other countries, governments are also challenged by the citizens' behaviors and the level of trust and cooperation they're getting from institutions and individuals equally. So it's not going to be easy, but it is the first determinant of success. The more we could unify between different countries, the practices, the more we can give clear guidance to the sector. As far as Saudi and what we're doing for the sector, we have been working very closely with the Ministry of Health, identifying detailed protocols across the total tourism value chain. And so we started with, as you rightly said, with the easiest, maybe, the hotels and hospitality at large. But we went now through all sort of even online businesses. So we've just introduced the health protocols for home sharing platforms, digital services, and as well as, of course, DMCs and tour operators. Those have not been announced, but we're expecting them to be announced in a week or so. Okay. And whatever we do is something that we try to make available for WTTC. And we also bring into our conversations with other countries under the hat of the G20 presidency.
Okay. Fantastic. Talking about those green lanes that Keith mentioned, I mean, what's Saudi been doing in terms of relationships with other countries and talking about allowing people into Saudi Arabia, or are we not that far along? Is it still very much just looking domestically at the moment?
So I believe Singapore has opened a lot faster than we have. But I know that the General Aviation Authority is implementing similar concepts. I would call them green lanes because it's the national color is green, but I'm not sure if the same protocols are in place. I know that they have looked at multiple international standards and aligned them with the Ministry of Health, just like every government entity today in Saudi Arabia. And I have to say, that Saudi Arabia has been, the government has been very, very, I would say, fatherly in its efforts. And the public and citizens have been taking it extremely with much gratefulness and appreciation and compliance. So I'll give you an example. We just finished a survey that included 1,000 respondents in Saudi. And when we asked them, would you consider domestic tourism and why? The number one answer is why was because we trust our government. How many of you would travel abroad? 11%. Okay. So and we're talking about the 3 months to come. So you can see that the measures that have been taken have not only controlled the spread, but more importantly, controlled the death rate, which I believe is one of the lowest globally.
Yeah, yeah. That's very interesting you should mention that, because it seems that what you both have in common is that the citizens of your country have really got on board and the governments have led it very well. I could make comparisons with the UK where it seems to be the opposite. We could be a long time coming out of this. So it is interesting to show that the citizens of a country do play a part in terms of not just getting the country back on its feet, but when we're talking about tourism, actually making it appear a safe place to visit. Keith, would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And so I think this element of trust is crucial in any sort of crisis. It doesn't have to be a pandemic. It can be any other sorts of crisis, whether even a prolonged economic recession, which I think many of our countries will be facing in the next 1 or 2 years. Getting the country through these sorts of crises require a certain level of trust between government and citizens. who will all be asked to do difficult things and make difficult sacrifices, such as staying at home and doing self-isolation. But beyond that, also, for specific to the tourism sector, trust is also needed as we reopen the economy. Because if how do I help our citizens to trust that as we slowly reopen the economy, it will be safe, right? As we slowly take in more visitors from other countries, it will be safe for them. So that level, that requires a lot of constant communication and great care on the part of the government.
Definitely. And talking about trust and transparency, I know that you've mentioned before about in terms of, not so much crisis communications, but it's really reputation management, isn't it? Can you tell us just quickly how you're doing that in terms of the message you put out to the world, reinforcing the measures? Because as I said before, if you don't tell anyone, we won't know. So how are you doing that?
Well, we've been actively reaching out through all our global offices. We have offices all over the world. And right from the very beginning of the pandemic, even before it was, well before it was declared a pandemic, we were already working through our networks all over the world to reach out to our trade partners, trade publications, to tell them what Singapore was doing. In the very early days, when we were still open and our borders were still open, we were sending clear messages that we were open for business. It's still okay to come. We have all the precautions in place. And obviously, as the crisis deepened, then the message had to change along the way. But we still tried our best to communicate quickly, and that's actually more difficult than it would appear, because it requires good language skills. Things that we can explain easily in English may not translate so well in Hindi or Tagalog
Yeah.
or Mandarin or Arabic. So then how do you quickly get that message out to our partners all around the world who may well be in the midst of organizing a large incentive group, for example, to come to Singapore? How do they think about the situation? So communicating, I cannot underestimate the value and the importance of swift, effective, clear communications to all our partners around the world. And since then having to communicate specific ideas like SG Clean, what we're doing on that front. And now as we move towards the reopening of the tourism sector, what are we doing on that front? We'll have to communicate that quite clearly as well.
Fahad, what's your view on messaging? Because I think Saudi has become quite adept at this quite quickly, hasn't it? In the past, we didn't hear much from Saudi Arabia, but once Vision 2030 was on the table and all these plans came out, the country is suddenly out there talking to the world and telling us what you're doing. So what's your view on what the messaging should be for Saudi Arabia in terms of its tourism industry going forward, given the circumstances?
I think we need to be both strategic and targeted. Strategic as in understanding what our key source markets that are ready for a communication at this time, because I believe the disposition, if I don't catch you when you're ready to listen, it's an absolute waste. So we need to be quite strategic in addressing our markets. Who are ready for us? Who are the markets that are ready for us, based on the state they're in and based on the travel sentiment? So we've exercised quite a lot of in-depth research on consumer sentiment, and thankfully, everybody's doing that now. So information is so available online. And through our targeted approach, we've identified more relevant markets for communication than others. But what we can see that in majority, people still want to break out of this lockdown and want to travel. And when they search for that, they want the least risk possible. And least risk is measured by multiple variables. One of the variables is the control of pandemic within that destination, and how well they present the protocols in a clear, unified language.
Yeah.
And they will hear it from the industry more than they will hear it from the destinations themselves. So if the industry tells them Saudi is a clear destination, so we wanted to make sure that our industry partners are aware of the measures we're taking place. And they don't just hear it from us, but they hear it also from global partners that have that credible voice. So WTTC, UNWTO, and other industry leaders and facilitators. So when they know which market is doing what, they would best direct OTAs and tour operators into these destinations. So to answer you in short, we wanted to make sure that we only go where there is readiness. And when we go through third party, and obviously do our awareness effort. So we were on CNN when probably very few destinations were communicating. We were in Pan Arab Network when very few destinations were communicating. So we have a lot of awareness to do, because we're still, as you said, we're very new destination. But again, being aware of what message works for you to be effective, and where to go and to whom to talk to for you to reap the right benefits from tourism.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting you were talking about the people wanting to travel, they want to break out of lockdown. We've known for a long time that one of the biggest trends is people want to travel for experiences. Now, Keith, I think that throughout this, you've been using social media and digital channels to create kind of experiences, haven't you? Or to bring that experiential aspect to life. Could you tell us a bit more about perhaps how we can use social media and digital to get people dreaming again and wanting to travel?
I think you've said it precisely. We want people to dream about travel, to yearn and to thirst for travel. The demand is, I think, the desire to travel and to experience new places is always there. It's very much part of what makes us human. Uh, and I think there will still be a rebound in travel eventually. But in the meantime, then the mission for us is, how do we make sure people don't forget about Singapore? How do we make sure that Singapore remains top of mind as a destination, as a desired destination for business or leisure travelers in the years to come? And so that's been the mission that we have. So right now, our marketing and our efforts is not tilted towards come to Singapore now in a conventional, traditional marketing thrust. Rather, it is, don't forget what we've always been good at. Don't forget what is great and attractive about Singapore. And we've done this not just at our level, at the tourism board level, but even at our major. We've done this together with our major attractions. We've identified what are the great assets that Marina Bay Sands, for example, has, or the zoo. But many of these of our tourism stakeholders have great assets, and we've been encouraging them to use these assets, social media assets, video assets, to push it out, to remind people what's great about Singapore. So don't forget us.
Fahad, now I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're starting a summer campaign very much targeting Saudi for Saudis, and again talking about the experiences they can have in their own country, because let's face it, you've got a lot of people there. What, 34 million? Is that the population thereabouts?
A little less, but yeah, nearly there. Yes, so yes, we are. I mean, research again tells us that nearly 81% want to travel, and as Keith said, the demand is there. People still want to travel. They just want to know when and where, and you need to stay top of mind. Now, for us, for domestic travelers, because this is our phase one, this is how we can go back and generating demand and supporting the sector the fastest, is what we wanted to basically understand what our travelers need and aspire for. And I think like many other travelers around the world, they're looking for summer-friendly destinations, whether it's better weather in summer, or it's beach and coastal destinations. And to very little that people know, Saudi Arabia has during summer as very hot destinations, very cool ones, and mountainous destinations that are even Saudis have never been to. Now, to be honest, this has been a great opportunity for local domestic visitors to actually or citizens to try Saudi Arabia when they might not have in other situations as much as now, because they feel that this is the safest. Even if other destinations open, 81% said, I prefer traveling within my country. Now, and I told you a while ago that the number one reason is they trust their government. So they trust the measures that have been taken. Now, the other thing is, as Keith said, everybody wants to explore a new destination. And luckily to us, the most beautiful destinations in Saudi Arabia for tourism have never been activated, and Saudis themselves aren't aware of. So our summer campaign, as much as it's based on the fundamentals of curiosity and trust that's available, that exists amongst any traveler, we also wanted to focus on the current pain point of the pandemic. So our creative concept is around breathe. So just break out of your lockdown. And because the number one insight is people are suffocating. And I'm not talking about suffocating, obviously, from a respiratory aspect, but more emotional and mental suffocation. Yes. So our whole creative campaign is around breathe, and it's breathe beautiful weather, breathe, again, emotionally, mentally. And we've identified 10 top destinations within Saudi along the Red Sea coast, which is, again, a global natural treasure that Saudi Arabia has not claimed its right of ownership of yet, but very soon we will. And we need to show the world what we have, and we will start with the Saudi travelers themselves.
Yeah. So as you say, it's actually quite an opportunity, while Saudis trust their government and want to explore, that you can actually create a much bigger domestic market. So yeah, little bit different for you, Keith, I guess, because Singapore's smaller, and I guess everyone in Singapore sees everything in Singapore. So now you're coming out into your first phase today of coming out of the measures that have been put in place. Tell me a little bit more about that and how that really impacts tourism, first of all.
Let me just go back to the point about domestic tourism, and I would disagree with your point that we've seen everything in Singapore, right? Honestly, I think if I were to ask an average Singaporean, he would say, "Oh, that's exactly the response that I would get. I've been to the zoo, I've been to Marina Bay, I've been to Orchard Road. What else is there to see in Singapore?" Well, if you look at the list of attractions and experiences on third-party websites like TripAdvisor, one would be surprised. Someone just pointed out to me that we have one of the world's largest concentrations of escape rooms and indoor play attractions in Singapore, in the world, here in Singapore. That's just one sliver of the lots of things which are yet undiscovered. So I would venture that even in a city destination like Singapore and many of our other counterparts around the world, that there are still a lot of undiscovered potential that we can entice and our local city residents to visit and to explore. And that's exactly what we're doing as well, because Singaporeans are also being advised not to travel overseas. So we do want to then create opportunities for them to experience Singapore a little bit more. And through their spending, whether it's through staycations or packages with attractions and F&B and other things happening here in Singapore, that hopefully through their spending, that would help save some of our businesses along the way.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I would like to go back to your point on how we come out of pandemic, and what you're doing with China, I think is very strategic. And if you create examples of dual alignment and unified approach, you just open markets and you guide others to do the same at a regional level or at any selected partnership level. And I think that really opens maybe not domestic, but I think that's the best way to go about it. You have a great global market next to you, next door. Unifying that will take domestic tourism to completely new heights. And we're trying to do the same with the Gulf countries and some other select countries that are ready to apply the safety stamp as well.
Mm. Keith, I mean, really,
yeah,
because you're a little bit ahead of the rest of the world, you've almost created a blueprint for other destinations to follow, if you don't mind me saying. You know, the way you're kind of trailblazing, and like Fahad just said, having the channel with China. Again, can you tell us a little bit more about that opening up and the phase one today?
Well, I'm not sure we are trailblazers. There are other countries that have also established or are almost ready to establish their own travel bubbles, like the Baltics, for example. Much of the European Union as well, as the summer season is poised to begin. And so I think we are just following in the footsteps of other countries that, you know, obviously Australia, New Zealand have been talking about their travel bubble for some time already. For China, it's because we have deep connections, business, tourism, and so on. Singapore businesses have deep interests in China and vice versa. So we wanted to also make sure that that the businesses can continue, that supply chains can continue as well, and that's been one of the considerations in our Green Lane negotiations with China. I would hasten to clarify that we are starting small and cautiously. So it is not in the initial phases of our Green Lane, we do not envisage an opening of leisure travel, and certainly not mass leisure travel. A lot of the initial first phase will be focused on essential business travel, both ways. So, for example, think of the Singaporean businessmen who have not visited their plants and factories in China for the last 2 months, right? And they do need to go and check on their workers and their plants in China. And similarly, the other way around. So that will be the focus of the first phase, the first waves of people through this reciprocal green lane. I would also hasten to say that the negotiation of green lanes can be fiendishly difficult, challenging, because even just agreeing on what standards to use when you have all such so many different tests that are now available for COVID can be, it's not easy to arrive at at a common level of trust, right, between the two countries, because ultimately, what is needed in a green lane arrangement is trust in the standards of both countries, and this will take some time to establish. But with China, we have established protocols, we have the relationships, we know them, they know us. That's made it a little bit easier. And of course, the situation is also improving greatly in China.
Sure.
Now, with our back to your question, sorry, on our first phase. Well, the very first phase of the opening of the Singapore economy there's very little in it for the tourism sector. In fact, as we have announced, the first phase of the reopening, which happens today here in Singapore, is very much tilted towards other parts of the economy. So, for example, manufacturing. A lot of workers can now go back to the factories, which have been pretty much closed for the last month and a half or so. So that is the first phase of the reopening is tilted towards that, towards construction activity. But if things proceed well and the public health situation in Singapore continues to improve, then we are optimistic that in a few weeks' time, we can move to the second phase. And that's where much of the rest of the economy, including retail, F&B, lifestyle, social activities can begin to slowly move back to some normalcy, including much of the tourism sector. And what we are doing right now is going through very detailed plans with our hotels, with the attractions, how they can open in a safe, controlled manner. It will not be opening the doors, with no controls whatsoever. Yeah.
No. Fahad, now I know everyone is going to want me to ask you about 2030. Everything's still on track. We've got all these amazing giga projects that we know all about. We're very excited about. What's the plan? Are they still going ahead? Can you reassure us?
Well, if you say it this way, I must say, I must reassure you. No, but it is absolutely the truth. A public statement has come from the leadership saying that the key drivers of 2030 are moving ahead as planned. Now, I might rightly assume, like you would, that a slowdown may have taken place for 3 to 6 months. But my understanding is that these most of the giga projects are very much in infancy stage, groundbreaking and development of infrastructure. So if anything that has happened the past 6 months, it has given them confidence to look at the future of tourism with a much more aggressive attitude and appetite. We have seen the pandemic affecting all businesses in terms of identifying what business models are more likely to sustain the future transformation going forward. And I think I've been on a personal level talking to several leaders of these giga projects, and I can tell you that they are absolutely on track in terms of funding, and I think that's the starting point. And the government has made sure that these projects, they're not looked at as luxury and entertainment. They're looked at as socio-economic engine drivers and engines. So for the whole economy, and we believe that our Vision 2030, which is all about transformation from being solely dependent on oil to diversified economy with a much better quality of life for local, regional, and global talents to come and thrive in. We need these giga projects. It's not luxury for us. And as I said earlier, tourism particularly gets attention because of the job creation it provides. And for Saudi Arabia, probably the socioeconomic challenge, the number one challenge, is unemployment. And when you look at unemployment, you have professionals, you have high-skilled, mid-skilled, and low-skilled. Usually the torture test of unemployment is the low-skilled and the mid-skilled. You don't have much problems with the professionals. And that's why tourism, because it addresses all, and it is future-proof, because travelers globally still will always look for authentic experiences and want that human interaction. So such human-led sectors will not be automated and lose all the jobs in the future. Rather, will maintain its provision of jobs for people. So for all those reasons, I say that the government recognizes this sector as very strategic, and the giga projects are great engines of socioeconomic diversification and solution for unemployment. So in short, we're absolutely on, and it's not because it's tourism, it's because it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, thank you. Great answer. Keith, talking about investment, particularly investment in people. Now, I know during the pandemic, the government has provided a lot of support, and through the Singapore Tourism Board, with some quite, a wide range of incentives, training, upskilling. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it really has shown, investment in people during a time where, a lot of people have lost their jobs.
Yes. So this is set in the context, there's a larger context, which is that the government has put a great emphasis over the last decade, in fact, in Singapore on continuing education and upgrading of skills so that older workers especially are not lost in an increasingly digital economy, right? And when we have crises like the pandemic, then that gives us extra impetus to incentivize companies to send their workers for their necessary skills, upgrading, and training. Because if you think about it, in good times when hotels are running 95% occupancy, they just have no capacity, no bandwidth to send their staff for training. Now this is an opportunity when things are low, very low, and demand is low. Can they now use this to send more people for the training that is necessary in a 21st century economy? So we've been putting a lot of emphasis into this. We've created a lot more supply. So we've worked very hard with the training institutes all over Singapore to make sure that they're delivering the right sorts of bite-sized courses and different sorts of training available, in particular in areas like data analysis, data analytics, digital skills. How do I train, for example, if a tourist guide who's been used to always just delivering their services through another company, now how can they develop new skills to reach out to more customers, even if those customers are not yet coming to Singapore? Can they use digital tools to reach out to those customers? Now I'm hearing that those sorts of questions coming from our industry, so we want to make sure that they have access to the training that they need. Even for something like MICE, for example, we just had a roundtable discussion with our MICE stakeholders, and they have been telling us, I asked them explicitly, what sorts of skills, investments in hardware, software, and people skills do you need to be able to deliver virtual and hybrid events so that you can still survive? And so they're giving us different types of skill sets, different types of tools that they need to invest in, and then we work with them to see how we can help them to build up these skills.
Fantastic. I mean, I know Saudi as well, obviously we've had great Saudization programs. The hospitality industry is very much on board with that. Fahad, is that still going ahead as planned? I mean, upskilling the population is essential, isn't it?
Absolutely. As I just said, the unemployment is probably the biggest pain for us, and thus we have nothing but to prioritize it. And as Keith said, we look at this sector with two, I would say, buckets of job families. One is the jobs in the industry driving seat. And as Keith said, today's world is moving into more agile businesses and digital first. So data, e-services, and everything, and sustainability, all the things that are future focused in the sector fall into job families in the first bucket. So driving the sector to future sustainable tourism. And the second bucket is for us, and maybe this is where the biggest job employment creation is made, is at the frontliners. Now, Saudi Arabia has a beautiful, beautiful culture, or I would say a family and mosaic of cultures that people don't know. That rawness that some people see, those that actually interact with it, they don't just see, they feel and touch the beauty of that human interaction. And we believe that the Saudi is extremely hospitable nation, and if you just come closer. So we want to make sure that we preserve these beautiful, diverse cultural qualities amongst our frontliners while upgrading the quality of service. Yeah. And I believe that this is, again, the second bucket and the biggest job employer segment, and we're addressing both.
Fabulous, thank you. Now, we do have quite a few questions from our online audience. We've got a very big audience today. So I'm going to go through them. You can both answer them. If you really want to, put your hand up first. Question one, this is from Laboni Chatterjee, who's the content manager at Fairfest Media Limited. Laboni says, do you think that the World Health Organization, after collaborating with authorities from all over the world throughout the crisis, can come up with safety standards that all nations must follow to allow tourism to develop again? Anyone like to answer that first? Keith.
I'll just say that yes, I think it's possible, but these will be seen as a baseline. Because, right. And I suspect if it's a baseline, then many countries will just want to add on to a baseline. Okay.
Fahad, anything to add to that?
I think the short answer is yes. And I think every country will have its own priorities and risk level that they need to, they need to think their country first. So the more we can put the primary measures in place and unified, the better for all. So we are, whether it comes from WHO or any other entity, but that's what we're trying to do. And again, through our role at the presidency of G20, listen to all and create primary or baseline measures that could be applied by everybody and gives the clarity to the sector globally.
Great, thank you. Second question from Mark, Business Development Manager at ITO Tours. For both of you, actually, when do you expect Singapore and Saudi to open their borders again?
Well, we are doing it slowly, and so the question is how fast, how large. I think this will all be calibrated. If the green lanes with China work and it doesn't lead to another wave of infections, then we will have more confidence in the green lanes and we will expand. But this will be a calibrated, cautious approach.
I would say the same thing. We've been probably very cautious in coming back and opening back our businesses, but we've started and we've just announced reopening of most of the business sectors, except for very few where heavy traffic and direct interaction is needed, like gyms and sports and salons and few others. So we want to make sure first that safety is addressed first and people come back to an open business and not get a backlash from that. So we want to monitor that. And I believe that in the coming months, I would assume if things go well from a safety point of view, because we've seen countries, and you might have heard Abu Dhabi just went on lockdown a day or two ago. So we need to be very cautious and we need to monitor closely. But if things go as we plan, I see that coming in a couple of months, I believe. But again, that's a guess, and I can only be guessing at this stage.
Fahad, do you think it might be that you work with other Gulf countries first, or not necessarily?
I think it's again, it's a moving target. As I said, we want to create our own bubble within the region, but it all depends on how well we work in parallel.
Right, thank you. Okay, what else do we have? Oh, another one's just popped up. Let me just, I think this is more talking about maybe how you can give examples of best practice. We have a question from Diana Martin, GM Marketing at Northern Cape Tourism. How can we do a countrywide cleaning regime in locations where we face informal settlements, lack of water and sanitation infrastructure, poor access to online platforms and other communication channels? So I guess it's, maybe talking about some of those public-private partnerships. Keith, what do you think?
I don't pretend to be able to give advice to different countries and different settings because everyone's context will be different. But I would say we have to start somewhere, right? And start small, start with what is doable. And I would say don't underestimate the power of the private sector to move, and the private and the people sector to be mobilized to do great things. I think in some ways, in some places, and even in Singapore, the role of government is to inspire people to step up and to do something for their neighborhood, for their precinct, that government may find difficult to do. And that's what I would suggest in some of these contexts.
Okay, Fahad, anything to add to that?
I wouldn't again say anything extra, so I'll leave it there.
I think, is there a point to make about what destinations can maybe learn from one another as responsible members, of the global community? Do you think that's...
I mean, sorry, Gemma, maybe I would actually encourage our viewers to look at bodies like the WTTC. That's core job is to look at global best practices that are needed by the private sector and applied by all, be it people, businesses, or governments. So the safety stamp is probably a very good starting point for those that are looking for guidance, because they're trying to apply what is basic and baseline best practices and try to promote to other countries. So probably that would be my best advice.
Okay. We have another question here from Balaji. We don't know where they're from or their surname, but that's all right. What confidence building measures are planned to attract GCC business community and GCC tourists? So I guess that applies to both of you.
I think the best, in my mind, if it's about building trust, then I would say your best indicator of future performance is past performance. And I can talk for Saudi. I think we have had amazing successes in containing the situation, despite the heavy spread in certain areas. I mean, we just, our numbers are still increasing, but if you look at the way it's treated and handled and traced, we're still maintaining below 1% death rate. And I want to go back to how much confidence should you project or promise, and how much you should hold people accountable for some of that as well. So the government can do to a certain point its role and maybe more, but at the end of the day, it's a personal decision to take risk or not. So and I think that businesses today are watching very carefully the coming back to opening up, and we'll monitor. So some businesses have chosen not to go back yet until they see how this coming period is to happen. But I can talk about our partners in the tourism sector. That I can speak with confidence. I can tell you probably, I mean, just to be on the safe side, I would say 95% of the businesses in Saudi, from travel agents to DMCs to hotels, are super excited to go back. And they see that the government has been nothing but a true partner, reducing the cost, giving them clearance and guidance, and guiding also the people. So to me, I see the trust is not the challenge. I see we just need to be cautious and wait and learn. We want to be ready when the doors are open, and we believe that the industry is moving forward with us.
Fabulous. Keith, I know GCC market's important to Singapore, isn't it? Do you have any thoughts on that, on engaging with the GCC?
Well, I mean, going to the earlier question, which is on confidence building, it's confidence building for everyone. It's not just for GCC visitors, but for everyone. And then our responsibility as a tourism organization is to be very clear-eyed about what are the factors that will add to a traveler's confidence in our destination. And out of this pandemic, I think it will boil down to our ability to maintain very strict safety, sanitization, health, hygiene standards across not individual establishments, but across the entire country. It's not just at an establishment level, but individual level as well. It is assurance that even if you do get sick for any reason in our country, that you will have access to great medical facilities and great healthcare easily. I know when I travel, I get stressed if any of my kids get sick, because if I don't know the language, if I don't know the healthcare system, well, I end up getting saddled with a big bill, and I don't know where to go, and so on. Right? How do I give people assurance that if you come to Singapore, that if you get ill for any reason, that don't worry about it, because you can still have access to great healthcare. And so getting to grips with the key factors that give people assurance, I think that's important. And then working at these factors slowly, one by one. Now, I want to come back to the question about what different countries can learn from each other. And maybe here I would just end off with a rather counterintuitive point, which is I don't think we should be in a rush to open up. I get a lot of feedback, and I get a lot of the conversations that I hear, I sense, and it worries me a little bit, that we are all seeming to be rushing to open. I would caution against that. Because, and I know businesses want to open up, but I worry that if we open up too quickly, too aggressively for international travel, then that could lead to subsequent waves of infection, and then the public health authorities say let's close up again. So then if we have to close up again and reopen, close and reopen, I think that's far more damaging to our country brand, far more damaging to business sentiments than a slow, gradual, calibrated approach of reopening.
Fantastic. You know what, Keith? That is a really great way to end our session, because we are literally out of time. So thank you both so much, gentlemen. You've both been fantastic, really insightful. Really appreciate your time, and thank you. We hope to see you again soon. So take care, both of you.
You.
And, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
No, you're
and
very
I hope I
Thank
welcome you and the viewers to Saudi very soon.
Yeah, definitely very soon.
Same to Singapore. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you.
Thank you all.